potentially how people identify, whether the Arabic language remains an important part of it and knowledge of the Arabic language, but also is it still vibrant within the community, like to the extent that people still take Arabic classes. I know for me as an Arab Canadian, one of the Americas, I went to Arabic classes as I came to Canada, I was 5, and I think that was pretty, even though I only stayed for a couple of years, it was pretty pivotal, I think, in shaping my own relationship to Arabic. It'd be interesting to hear some of your thoughts on that. And then for Yusuf, we have some questions about sort of the history and trajectory of Arab American voter behavior. I don't know how much historical work we have on this to talk about trajectories, but do we have estimates, for example, for the number of Arab Americans who voted for Trump in 2016 versus 2020? Has there been, and this, you talked about this a little bit at the end, there might be sort of a regression back to the mean. And what does that say, if anything, about Arab American voter preferences? And here I maybe would like to add, questions also, in your survey, I don't know if you probed this, I think you would have probably shown it if you did, but I was very curious to also try to think about anti-Black and anti-Blackness within the Arab American community and the extent to which that maybe also has generational differences. I know that was, and I don't know how much we can infer from that, from voting behavior for Obama, for example, but also I know that that's been part of the analysis, at least in the media landscape, of, what might explain some pro-Trump voting behavior in the 2020 election among Arab Americans, and the extent to which this is just media speak, and whether we have data to back that up. I know that's a lot, so just try to get at some of that potentially. And we'll probably run a little bit long on our expected webinar time, hopefully, but hopefully we can wrap this up around 10:05 EST. So I'll pass it to whichever one of you wants to take the first of those questions.
Claudia, please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I think a lot of people want to hear about voting patterns and the whole and that aspect. So I'll be fairly quick. So your question is basically in terms of Arabic language, what are we doing as far as keeping it vibrant within the community? And if anyone,
yeah, and the extent to which maybe it affects identity, whether people speak the language, does it shape?
Yeah. Okay. So yes, absolutely. And I think there's two parts of someone's identity that I would say really feed into like the impact of whether they have a desire to maintain a linguistic fluency or not. Definitely a religious tie, because reading the Quran means that you have to read Arabic. And then the level of religiosity. So it's like if you have a desire to continue your education in that kind of capacity. There are second generation, young parents who had like no one in their house can speak anything other than Arabic. And these are, youth who are born and raised in the States. So there's some where it's like, this is a very prominent part of our identity. Like if you don't speak Arabic, then what makes you Arabic, Arab? So I think that was really, really important for some people. But then, it seemed that it was tied in with a religious aspect, and then tied in with how you perceived yourself within the community. So it's like if you were more likely to have friends and social ties that were out of the Arab community, out of the Arab network, then you kind of cared about it less in maintaining it. And you were also able to maintain it less because you had less opportunity to kind of speak it. People in Bridgeview, though, really were able to maintain it more because there's a higher immigrant population there. And so it's like my uncle just came from the Middle East and, or my grandma, or, like they had a really closer ethnic community and tie. And so that was sort of played into the level of fluency that they had. So yeah, it kind of varied, I guess.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, I imagine that, yeah, it's going to be complex for sure. I mean, that's a question even in the Arab world, right? When we study about Arab identity in the Arab world, the question of, when we think about the Maghrib and the extent to which kind of a standardized Arabic is critical to identity. So that's really interesting to see that also in the Arab American context. Yusuf, I'll pass it over to you for the myriad set of questions around basically the history of Arab American voter behavior in 5 minutes.
So as you kind of alluded to, we don't really have much insight into Arab American voting behavior too far into the past. One thing that we can say is that the first time there was a so-called Muslim bloc vote, it was for the Republican presidential candidate in the year 2000. For those of you who don't remember, George W. Bush, and there was a large kind of immigrant push in particular for that, and so that minority community, American Muslims more generally, Arab Americans included within them, were kind of leaning more towards the Republican even back then, right? And it's if you think about it, right, the kind of social conservatism, the tendency to be entrepreneurs, right? I mean, that does kind of mesh with the kind of Reaganite view of the Republican Party that proliferated at that time. That Reaganite view of the Republican Party is not exactly central at the moment, but nonetheless, there's still some appeal to the Republican Party among more socially conservative elements, both within the American Muslim community as well as within the broader Arab American community. In terms of racial attitudes, a finding that kind of blew my mind was in that same data that I showed you about the voting behavior, the Arab American Institute, that's their tracking poll, that's where that came from. They also asked, overall, what is your opinion of demonstrations in the country in support of Black lives? 46% of all Arab Americans have a strongly positive view. 24% have a somewhat positive view. So you're talking about, fully 3/4 of the Arab American population that have a positive view of the Black Lives Matter protests. So that's really saying something. But that's not to say that they buy into the general kind of woke agenda, if you want to be, kind of crude about it, right? And I think that was kind of partly what was, kind of pushing some folks towards Trump. I would say probably more folks towards Trump than in 2016. We see this in a number of patterns among various minority groups, and Arab Americans are included within them. And so I'll conclude by just saying that when we are studying Arab Americans, and to the point that I was making during my presentation as well, we can't imagine that this is a special, oh so special, unique snowflake of a group. Like, no, they're going to be in the same environment as other communities. They're going to have the same social forces acting on them, pushing them or pulling them in certain directions. And we have to be cognizant of that, and the various dynamics that exist within comparable groups may very well be the same ones that we see within this minority group as well.
Wow, that was incredible. So